My name is Sarah Koonts, and I'm the Director of the Division of Archives and Records, otherwise known as the State Archives, in North Carolina. The State Archives is part of the larger Department of Cultural Resources, and it's really our job to bring history to the people of North Carolina. People come to the search room to access our everyday collections, and we're very open about having people handle the originals, so usually unless there's a preservation reason, they can handle the original materials. But we do store some of our most valuable documents in a security vault in the building. One of our vaults contains our vault collection, which is documents that are deemed to be most important and most valuable and need to be stored in the vault. The majority of the vault is also taken up with security microfilm from state and local agencies, so we also serve as sort of a disaster preparedness backup for government entities across the state. But we did carve out a space for the crown jewels of our collection. Well, first we're going to see one of the crown jewels of our collection, the Carolina Charter of 1663. So this is the colonial charter that King Charles II gave to the 8 Lords Proprietors, really his 8 closest friends, as a reward for helping restore him to the throne of England. And it allows them to create a colony in this new land called Carolina. And at that time, Carolina was really North and South Carolina, way down even closer towards Georgia, and they really knew no western boundary, so it went as far west as you could imagine. And this is the first page of that colonial charter. The state purchased this document in 1947 when it came up for sale in England. So as I said, this is a very large document. There's 4 pages to this document, but the front page is really the most beautiful page, including the portrait of King Charles II here in the upper corner. It's essentially a giant cross between a land grant and a charter for them to start this colony. And it lists off all their rights and the things that they're allowed to do in starting this colony, including form their own government and run the land as they saw fit. And in DCR, we really refer to this as the birth certificate of North Carolina. You really see the beginnings of self-government in this document. They were allowed to have an amount of religious toleration and freedom in the colony. They were allowed to set up the government with a representative government where they were electing people to a council. So you're really seeing the foundation of the colonial government in North Carolina. In 1776, some of the leaders in North Carolina who were meeting with representatives from other states were asking John Adams, exactly what do you think a good government looks like? And in response to this, Adams penned his famous Thoughts on Government letter. So this was originally sent to the leaders in North Carolina, and it was forwarded to the colonial leaders, and they actually used a lot of his ideas when they were founding the first Constitution for the state of North Carolina, what would become the state of North Carolina. Later on, because many people were asking Adams for the same information, this got turned into a pamphlet and was published at the time, but this was really the first opportunity that he had actually had to sit and write his thoughts down on what would a good government look like. And it's really sort of a response to the argument that checks and balances were not necessary. He does talk about what does a good government look like, and he's in favor of a representative government and a government that balances itself out so that not one branch has all the authority and the power over the other branches. So if you're here in Raleigh, you might think that Raleigh's always been the capital of North Carolina, but that's not the case. North Carolina actually had several colonial capitals, and at the time of the Revolutionary War, it was in New Bern. But the leaders of North Carolina decided that they really needed to set a permanent capital. And so they decided to set the capital in this wild land that would eventually become Raleigh. And it was supposed to be within 10 miles of Isaac Hunter's Tavern. So in 1792, when they finally finalized the purchase of land from Joel Lane within 10 miles of Isaac Hunter's Tavern, one of the senators at the time, William Christmas, set about, he was also a surveyor, set about creating a survey of what Raleigh would look like. So this is the foundation of the formation of Raleigh from 1792. And he's plotting this out in a very orderly, organized manner, and you can see some of the remnants of his original plan. This is Union Square, where he decided this was a nice, beautiful vista on a hill, and the Capitol building would sit there. And he planned the city such that there would be 4 major streets coming off the Capitol, and there were 4 public squares that would be an ideal place for meeting and gathering within the city. And some of these squares do exist today, including Moore Square is still around, and so is Nash Square. Let's fast forward to the time of the early Constitution. North Carolina decided in a constitutional convention in 1787 to reject the Constitution as written. They felt like, the leaders in North Carolina felt like there were not enough protections for individual liberties that would be afforded if we had a Bill of Rights. So Rhode Island and North Carolina did not ratify the Constitution at the time. So actually the government formed without us. Fast forward to the first Congress. One of their first acts of business in New York was to create a Bill of Rights. And that got sent to North Carolina. All the original states and the federal government got a copy. This is North Carolina's copy that was sent to us by George Washington. North Carolina leaders were thrilled, so they quickly then ratified the Constitution and they accepted the Bill of Rights. And if you'll look, most people don't remember this, but there were actually 12 proposed amendments at the time. States could consider each of them individually. North Carolina ratified all 12, but not all states liked all 12. So what you see is 2 through 12 become 1 through 10, the First Amendments. So if you're looking for your freedom of speech and those sorts of things, you need to look through 3 through 12 become 1 through 10. What makes our copy of the Bill of Rights special is that it remained in our custody until 1865 in the closing days of the Civil War, when a Union soldier stole it out of that Capitol on Union Square and took it home with him. And he sold it to a friend of his a year later for $5. And a few years later, it came to the attention of North Carolina leaders that this gentleman in Indianapolis had the Bill of Rights in his office. And so that started a long, protracted discussion with him about getting it back. And that was unsuccessful. So over the years, North Carolina leaders were offered the opportunity to buy it back, and each time they declined, including stating at one time that while it was out of our custody, it will remain a memorial to individual theft. And they said, we're not going to pay for what's rightfully ours. So fast forward to 2003, when some people had the document and were going to sell it to a museum, the Constitutional Center in Philadelphia. Word of its existence again reached North Carolina leaders, and at that point we took action to stop the sale, and we eventually regained custody of the document 10 years ago. And so ours has had a long and interesting journey around the country, but we're glad it's back home. Once North Carolina ratified the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, then we get to my favorite document that we have. So North Carolina is now part of the Union. And George Washington sits down and writes a personal letter, this is all in his hand, to the governor and the Council of State in North Carolina. And he talks about how happy he is to hear that we have ratified the Constitution and we're part of the Union. And so I just like this. This is an all-personal letter from George Washington with his distinct signature. And it's special to North Carolina because we really were holding out for a Bill of Rights. And so this comes on the heels of that document becoming part of the Constitution. We also have fun things in our vault collection. A lot of people know North Carolina as the Tar Heel state. There's a lot of disagreement as to when that really first officially showed up, but we have some of the earliest written documentation of referencing North Carolinians as Tar Heels, and that really starts during the Civil War. And so these are 3 things that talk about that. This one's probably the easiest to see. This is a letter from a gentleman to a friend of his, and he's describing a battle in Virginia. So here's the start of the letter, and in it, then he talks about it really was a Tar Heel fight, and they had General Lee thanking God, which you know is something serious. So in this case, he's describing the story about General Lee thanking God for the Tar Heels in the fight. So in 1866, this is the first time it's a printed reference. You have a song being written by Tar Heel called "Wearing of the Gray." Again, that's 1866. North Carolina was famous in the colonial times through the Civil War for our tar and pitch industry. We really had a thriving industry down at the coast, getting those products out for use in shipbuilding and naval stores and things like that. So it was not uncommon for people to know that about North Carolina, that there was a huge tar and pitch industry. There's some discussion that we were called the Tar Heels before that, but really it's around the Civil War where we can find official records of that and people talking about citizens as being Tar Heels. Some think it was first used as a little bit of a derogatory term, but it became sort of known as a positive thing, that we stuck in the battle and stuck in the fight in terms of the Civil War, and that's where they got the name Tar Heel. So we've tried to keep together the things that are early references, either in letters or printed or in a diary, where they refer to North Carolinians as Tar Heel. So we sort of turned it on its head from being a term of disdain to a term of pride. State archives are important for also showing the history of the state, whether it's big or small. Not everything is a Bill of Rights value, but it's worth keeping because it shows the story of where your family came from or what was happening in the state at that particular time. And it's important that we be able to share that with people, whether they come in person or they look online at our collections.